They have 11 carriers. Wow. Has that been done before? Yeah, I didn't think so. No, tell me, so what are they going to attack? Huh? Nothing at all. Wait, what? No, not nothing at all. Some nothing at all. Some nothing at... I don't get it. November 19th, 1943. Little things and individual events can change the course of history, right? For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the kingdom was lost. Well, this week, one such rider is nearly lost, nearly killed, and that rider is Franklin Roosevelt. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Soviets liberated Kiev, a major prize. They were in fact advancing in many parts of the Eastern Front, though the Germans were arranging a counterattack near Kiev. The action in Italy was bloody and cold, and the Allies may be grinding to a halt there. In the Solomons, Allied reinforcements beefed up Bougainville, and the Japanese in large part abandoned Rabaul as a naval base after repeated attacks against it. The force of Marines that I mentioned setting sail with a huge escort from the New Hebrides back on the 11th discovers where they are going this week on the 14th. It is actually one of two forces that set sail, the southern one under Harry Hill. And he announces, just 6 days from today at 8:30 a.m., we're going to hit Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. We're going to land on this island at the end of the atoll. The natives call it Baishio. Before we land on this place, we're going to pound it with naval shell fire and dive bombers. We're going to steamroller that place until hell wouldn't have it. The northern force is headed towards Makin Atoll, like 150 kilometers north of Tarawa. It's a smaller force, 6,700 men of the 27th Army Division, as opposed to 18,000 Marines, with a smaller but still impressive escort. Ray Spruance, commanding the Central Pacific Force, is running this whole operation, named Galvanic, though the landings that are scheduled for next week are under Richmond Turner, the amphibious boss. That's going to be covered by the greatest carrier force ever assembled. Task Force 50, 4 new Essex-class carriers, 5 light carriers, and good old carriers Lexington and Saratoga, all under Charles Pownall, who also has 6 battleships and loads of cruisers and destroyers. He thinks they can not only guard both forces, but handle pretty much anything the Japanese combined fleet might throw at them. Today, the 19th, carrier planes raid Mili, Tarawa, Makin, and Nauru in preparation for the coming landings. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was now moving into overwhelming numerical dominance. The crisis of the previous year, when a lack of carriers and battleships had threatened the U.S. Navy's ability to hold on to Guadalcanal, was being replaced by a new problem: how to supply and fuel the huge fleets operating over the distances of the Pacific. More than 200 warships would be involved in Galvanic. To keep them at sea and fighting for 3 weeks, thousands of miles from the fleet base in Pearl Harbor, required a logistics and support operation on a scale never before attempted by any Navy in history. Well, they do have the Service Force Pacific Fleet under William Calhoun, which has a massive armada of transports, supply ships, repair ships, and oil barges. There is a floating base at Funafuti Lagoon in the Ellis Islands, and everything the fleet needs is there. See, by now, U.S. shipyards are cranking out warships and Liberty freighters by the dozens to execute the Orange Strategy across the Central Pacific. At the Quebec Conference in August, the Combined Chiefs of Staff had decided to give this the green light since the U-boat war had turned so much against the Germans. The Quadrant Directive, which initiated the first stage of the Orange War plan to punch through the outer crust of Japan's Pacific Island defense, left uncertain whether the thrust would continue through to the Philippines. The U.S. Joint Chiefs had originally hoped that an eastward drive by the Chinese nationalists would free Hong Kong or Shanghai's port facilities. But the British reluctance to embark on a major offensive in Burma to open up the overland supply route that Chiang Kai-shek would need to support such a drive forced the American Joint Planning Staff after Quebec to consider Formosa, with Okinawa or Manila as alternative springboards from which to mount the invasion of Japan. Pacific Ocean Theater Commander Chester Nimitz, however, does not want to launch his untested amphibious forces against heavily fortified bases with strong air cover, hence hitting the Gilberts now before tackling the better defended Marshalls. Well, the attacks are set to go off tomorrow. Also, down in the Solomon Islands on Bougainville on the 14th, the rest of 37th Infantry and the 21st Marines land. By now, they've established themselves in a 5-kilometer zone from the beaches and have enough space for 3 naval construction battalions to start work on 2 airfields. But if Allied attacks are going to begin around the Pacific, they may well stop around Italy. Yep, on the 13th, 5th Army Commander Mark Clark tells Army Group Commander Harold Alexander that 5th Army attacks should stop for the time being. 5 of his 7 divisions have been in action pretty much constantly since Salerno 2 months ago, and the British are stuck at Monte Camino. On the 15th, Alexander agrees to Clark's suggestion. They will hold position for the next 2 weeks to rest and refit. You know, on the western and eastern sides of Italy, 5th and 8th Armies are really fighting disjointed wars, separated by the Apennines. 8th Army is still moving forwards, taking Atessa the 13th and Perano the 14th. On the 15th, they have small units crossing the Sangro River, but no solid foothold. Today, the 19th, the Germans withdraw the remainder of their forces across the Sangro. The Allies will need a major offensive to expand their little footholds there. But what about the enemy in this theater of the war? Well, with the Allies banging against Montes Camino and La Defensa, smiling Albert Kesselring wants to pull back from San Pietro and a couple miles up the valley. Adolf Hitler says okay, but then changes his mind a few hours later and orders German 10th Army to hold at Pietro. So while Clark pauses to regroup, Kesselring brings over units from the Adriatic side of the country. Clark has, though, his eyes on San Pietro as the center of his next attacks. When making plans, his first impulse was to attack simultaneously across the front with 3 corps. Noting that none of the 3 would have adequate artillery or air support, Truscott argued that a worse plan would be difficult to conceive. Truscott being General Lucian Truscott. Already on the 11th, though, Clark revises things and tells his staff that the hills north of San Pietro are the critical territory. He means Monte Sammucro. So Operation Raincoat is and will be planned during the break in action. The basic idea will be for British 10th Corps and US 2nd Corps to take Camino and La Defensa on the west of the Mignano Gap, while 6th Corps would take San Pietro and Sammucro to the east. But the Allied force in Italy would soon reach 14 divisions. Clark's intelligence estimated that 185,000 German troops in 11 divisions now defended southern Italy, with another 12 divisions in the north. The Allied strategy of tying up German forces appeared to be succeeding, albeit through a war of mutual attrition. Every hour's delay here gave enemy sappers another hour to strengthen their main defensive fortifications around Cassino, 7 miles north. Clark tells Alexander that a strong defense at San Pietro is unlikely, and Sammucro seems to be empty of German troops. We'll see about that in a week or 2. Elsewhere in the general Mediterranean region, the Battle of Leros ends in the Germans' favor the 16th as they force the Allies to surrender. Though the Allies are still taking plenty of places in the Soviet Union. On the 14th, Ivan Konev resumes his drive towards Kryvyi Rog and Kirovograd, but the mud really stops him this time. However, to his right, 52nd Army manages to get a foothold across the Dnieper at Cherkasy the 13th. The German 8th Army still holds on. Also on the 13th to the south, the Soviets finished taking Zhytomyr and advanced towards Korostin, taking it the 18th. Now that they've taken Korostin and Zhytomyr, they've cut the main rail links between Army Group South and Center. However, Army Group South Commander Erich von Manstein has launched his counterattack, which he began preparing already early last week, as we saw. His plan at first was a pincer movement, but he doesn't have the force required. But Fastov last week and Zhytomyr this week are major places to lose, so he hurries his butt up, sending the 48th Panzer Corps in. The main attacks begin already the 14th, with the 1st Panzer Division and SS Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler both making respectable gains. By the 18th, leading units from 1st Panzers reached the Zhytomyr-Kiev road, and today, the 19th, they enter the outskirts of Zhytomyr. Jumping much further north along the battle lines, Andrei Yeremenko is dismissed today as commander of the 1st Baltic Front. He was actually upbraided last week for losing his cool when the Germans drove towards Neidell. He will be replaced by Ivan Bagramian. The 11th Guards Army has been assigned to that front to help it drive on Gorodok and Vitebsk. The big offensive begins already the 16th, even though a surprise thaw makes the roads nearly impassable to motor vehicles. The Soviet spearheads come within a few kilometers of the Gorodok-Nevel road the 18th, but they can't support that attack, and fighting continues into next week without achieving its goals. We saw Soviet 3rd Shock Army make real gains last week. However, this week, several attempts to advance eastward meet with failure. 2 days from now, Markian Popov will order the 2nd Baltic Front over to defense. Vasily Sokolovsky's Western Front is trying for Orsha, which Stavka thinks vital to taking Belorussia. He's got 4 armies on both sides of the Smolensk-Orsha highway for the job. They attack along a 25-kilometer front, the 14th, after a pretty long artillery barrage. They keep attacking the rest of the week and throw in all the reserves and manage to advance in some places 4 kilometers or maybe a bit more, in places far less, for nearly 40,000 casualties before calling off the assault yesterday. Stavka does, though, insist that the attacks continue, so they likely will in the near future. One small Allied attack that sees success this week happens in occupied Norway. On the 16th, 160 Allied bombers hit the Vimork hydroelectric power station and heavy water facility. Heavy water can be used to moderate nuclear reactions, as I've talked about before. We also saw the German supply of heavy water at Vimork destroyed earlier this year in Operation Gunnerside. 20 civilians are now killed in this raid. There's also a big raid the 18th. And though the bombers missed the actual heavy water factory, they damaged the power station so badly that no heavy water can be produced there. Heavy water stocks are to be brought back to Germany, since the Germans worry about their safety, although Norwegian agents pass the intel on to Britain, and the Allies will try to destroy them. Speaking of destruction, one single weapon of destruction, a torpedo, nearly changes history this week. On the 14th, American President Franklin Roosevelt is en route to Cairo and then on to Tehran for conferences, traveling in a convoy aboard battleship Iowa with his Secretary of State Cordell Hull and most of the American top military brass. Roosevelt requests an AA drill to see how the ship defends itself. Balloons are released, which Iowa's gunners and other ships too shoot down. Then the destroyer William D. Porter demonstrates a torpedo drill by simulating an attack on Iowa. But the number 3 torpedo has a live warhead. The torpedo is released and it heads for Iowa. It'll take 2 minutes to reach her, but battleships can't turn that easily. The destroyer's commander, Wilfred Walter, wants to signal Iowa, but this is a top-secret convoy for obvious reasons and is under radio silence, so a signal man does the job. Unfortunately, in haste or whatever, he signals that a torpedo is moving away from Iowa, and then he signals that the destroyer is reversing at full speed. Walter then breaks radio silence and tells Iowa that a torpedo is in the water. Iowa breaks sharply to starboard and has her guns fire on the torpedo while the crew races to emergency stations. The ship manages to make the turn, and the torpedo explodes in its wake, not that far from the ship. Walter assures everyone that this is an accident, but there is no immediate explanation for the live torpedo, so the destroyer is ordered to leave the convoy and head for Bermuda. The entire crew is placed under arrest upon arrival, which is the first time that's happened to a U.S. naval crew. Several days of grilling the crewmen finally determined there is no conspiracy to kill the president, and a live primer was left in the tube by accident by crewman Lawton Dunstan when he removed the other ones. When the torpedo actually fired, he panicked and threw the primer overboard. He is sentenced to 14 years hard labor, but Roosevelt orders the Navy to not punish him for what is clearly a mistake that in the end harmed no one. This, apparently, is not the first mishap for destroyer William Porter of the trip. On the 13th, the day before the torpedo event, a depth charge that was badly secured fell off the deck and exploded, causing the whole convoy to take evasive maneuvers. Ship's logs do not mention this, though, so it might not actually be true. And actually, the destroyer's ship's log also does not mention the whole crew being arrested either. Make of that what you will, though they are at Bermuda the 16th through the 23rd of November. And the week comes to its end, with more Soviet advances, even as Manstein's counterattack gains important ground. The fighting in Italy is slowing and even being called to a halt, and there are warm-ups for the big attack soon to come on the Gilbert Islands. Despite retaking Zhytomyr, and despite some 20,000 Soviet soldiers being killed this week in the field, Joseph Goebbels writes in his diary, "Where will it ever end? The Soviets have reserves of which we never dreamed, in even our most pessimistic estimates." Well, you know, this is one of the classic blunders. In fact, it is the most famous of them, slightly more well-known than never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line. It is never get involved in a land war in Asia. I guess Goebbels and company never consulted with Vizzini when they made their battle plans. Maybe they should have done so. The third classic blunder, of course, is never stop supporting projects you believe in. But those of you in the Time Ghost Army know that one, and the rest of you, well, you ought to join the Army yourself. You don't want to make a classic blunder, do you? These are the newest Army officers. The Army member of the week is Jiří Bauer. You too can join at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.